defense and examination of Ms. Chelsea Romph. She joined us about 3 years ago now. This is your fourth fall, correct?
Yes.
And then time
My
flies.
last fall.
Fourth and last fall.
Last fall.
So we're going to have a presentation, some questions from the public audience, and then a private examination afterwards. Successfully culminating before 3 because I understand we have a conflict.
I have to teach you things.
Yes, so we'll be
There's
done.
gonna be plenty of time.
Oh, it's plenty of time. All right, without further ado, Chelsea.
Hi, everybody. I am Chelsea today. I'm Chelsea Romph. This is, of course, the defense for my undergraduate honors thesis. I'm under the School of Renewable Resources. My major is Natural Resource Ecology and Management with a concentration in wildlife ecology. That's me. And this is my thesis, The Power of Wording and Evaluation on Framing Effects. So getting started, what are framing effects? What is my thesis about? What am I talking about? Why, as an ecologist, does this matter? So I took an idea from researcher Hull that framing effects kind of sway an audience and influence the way an audience thinks without really altering any relevant or original information. And so this is kind of hard to discuss through simple dictionary definitions because framing effects are pretty new in the literature. It's still being looked at, and that's just in writing. Framing effects are really as old as time. They're as old as language because ultimately we know that there are certain languages and devices that we can use to persuade or influence people. But in terms of writing and having it written down, they are pretty new. So I'm going to, instead of trying to really define what they are, kind of translate more to you what they are through examples. So a certain framing effect mechanism could be the order of information in the way that it's presented. So for example, in my thesis, I discussed a study in which people asked California homeowners, half of them were asked if they would insure their home, it's a little tricky wording. Half of them were proposed with what they would lose if they didn't insulate their homes. The other half were proposed with what they would gain monetarily if they did insulate their homes. Those that were told what they would lose were actually chose to insulate their homes more. And so they saw a bit of a favoring toward, lost language as the journal put it, and that they preferred hearing what they lose. But other studies have shown that people prefer to hear what they would gain. They prefer to hear the benefits. So we're seeing this really complex scenario that may work on a very specific basis. And it kind of just complicates things, but it does show that depending on the situation, people do have a preference for the way something is ordered. And for the sake of my study and keeping things simple for my undergraduate thesis, I chose to focus on word choice and tone. Now, of course, all of these things that I'm talking about and framing effects in general intertwine with each other. They're built upon each other because it's language, it's words, etc. And so for my presentation, I chose to kind of break down how I interpret and think about these things. So framing effects were an umbrella. This was an umbrella term. I think about word choice kind of being obviously at the basis of it, and that our words are what make up how we convey something, our tone, which moves up to the next level of the pyramid, and then overall building into what we know generally as framing effects, but getting into that more specifically with word choice at the bottom. Our words carry connotations, they carry meaning, and how a lot of times we see words on an emotional spectrum. They can provoke certain feelings for us, and the tricky things about our language is that it's very individualistic. It's very dependent on our own experiences. An example I like to think about, and that I mentioned in the paper, is there's a study based on the word mutation and how people felt about it. And so the way someone walking on the street may think about the word mutation, they may have watched a lot of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles growing up, but what Dr. Taylor may think about the word mutation, as a scientist and researcher who heavily works with it, she may see the word as very objective and very scientific, or someone may actually carry a negative connotation with it. So again, thinking about our language and how it influences people is tricky because it is very dependent on the person. And then next, moving up in that pyramid, tone, of course, is created by our word choice, and with those words that have a very heavy emotional background, the frequency and the way in which we use them is going to kind of create a certain tone and sound of what we're talking about. And so it's kind of unspoken that words are on an emotional spectrum, and when we think about the words, say, happy and ecstatic, we kind of understand that ecstatic is on the more extreme end of this hypothetical spectrum that we have in our minds. And so that's undeniable. And so when you start using a lot of words like that that either carry strong connotations or emotional value, you create a context of tone. And for the purpose of my research and presentation, I have created the constructs of logical and emotional tone. In science and research and a lot of academic settings, we use a logical tone, and generally what you see with that is it's absent with emotion-laden words in order to minimize or erase the perception of biases. And so you're not going to see adjectives that are describing things in a very strong way, because that may convey bias and cancel your credibility in a way. So, like I said, framing effects are kind of as old as time. We know that they're there in a way unspokenly, but we have to quantify it, right? And that's the hard part. So for me as an ecologist, looking at framing effects in a polarized discourse, because a lot of the times what we're trying to do as scientists, researchers, ecologists, and even not just in our academic lives and professional lives, we have to communicate, convey, and in a way persuade people to understand what we're trying to say, to communicate our research. And so they're looking at framing effects in medical testing, seeing how patients understand what's being told to them, and to see which treatments they're preferring based on the information that's delivered to them. We're looking at housing insurance and, like I said, installations. And so you start getting into money and how people want to lose or gain money based on what they're being communicated. Policy, huge part of all of our lives. And so communication with policymakers, with the general public, has a huge influence in our careers. And one reason I did this as an ecologist, again, what this relates to in my field is climate change. It's very big right now. It's very relevant, whether we believe in it or not, whichever side of the spectrum we're on. It's a very prevalent issue right now. And one of the biggest issues, in my opinion, that I have interpreted is communication. And because we have the scientific knowledge, it's just about getting it out and communicating and kind of developing a dialogue and a common ground. And so this is just a figure from the Pew Research Center, and it's from 2014, but you can see over the few decades how there's been a polarization in political ideology. And I can most definitely come back to this source to let you guys look back on it, but it's the main point is just to show that we're seeing a really kind of further contrast just based on principle, and that's why a lot of times, for example, you hear climate change as a liberal agenda, just things kind of being made political. So why does all this matter? I took this quote from Dr. Gary M. King. He actually spoke at a climate action teaching summit I attended, and I asked him for permission to use it because I really enjoyed it to summarize why this is relevant and important for me. I don't have to read it aloud because I know you guys can all read, but kind of just summarizing, he says that until we employ political and moral philosophies within a framework where we can develop a consensus, our scientific solutions are not going to help us, which is frustrating because it takes so long, and it takes so long to build that foundation of science. But when we have it and we can't communicate it to the right people, or the people that are going to help us make changes, it is kind of difficult to get things done. So zoos, this kind of leads into my methodology just a bit. The topic of zoos is polarized, a little bit paralleling to climate change. It also made a bid for a community studies site, but that was just a small reason why I chose to focus the topic of my questionnaires on zoos. But it's polarized for a variety of different reasons: the history of zoos, kind of differences, and societal typologies, which we'll get into later. But also it is relevant to my career. I grew up going to zoos. I know a lot of people who do, yet it's still a polarized issue. And maybe I'll work in one day, whether that's a zoo or sanctuary or wildlife agency. It still provided a place of polarization for me to kind of explore my research in. This photo's by me. So my study site, like I said, was at the Memphis Zoo in Memphis, Tennessee. It's accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And my testing was done over an 11-week period. All of my survey respondents were 18 years or older, and they consisted of no sensitive groups. So there's the Memphis Zoo. There's me in uniform working at the zoo, very snazzy. So I designed 2 surveys to test 2 main constructs, like I mentioned earlier, word choice and tone. And here is survey A. For word choice, I chose to choose 4 words with housing and containing on 2 kind of ends of the spectrum I designed, housing being a more positive end of the spectrum and containing being a more negative, and keeping exhibiting word to be a bit more neutral anywhere in between, but we're supposed to hold less of a charged value with them. So recipients were to choose only one of these in the statements they preferred. And on survey B, I designed 2 sections. These are survey B's testing tone. Each section is conveying relatively the same information, but of course they're testing a logical and an emotional tone. And so in the logical tones, you're seeing a bit more quantitative language, and in your emotional tones, which are your 2 second options, you're seeing emotional language, which we can come back to, of course, but you guys also have the thesis in front of you. So looking at the results, it is pretty visually obvious to see the preferences here, but housing was statistically selected over keeping and containing, as well as exhibiting was statistically selected over keeping and containing as well. So these were our 2 favorites. I'll get into that in the discussion. And in survey B, so we had selection for logic 1 over emotion 1 in our first section on survey B. However, we didn't have any preference selection in the second section for logic 2 or emotion 2, which we'll get into in the discussion. So talking about survey A, housing and exhibiting were chosen more, and so like I said, housing didn't surprise me because I did place it on that strong positive side on that emotional spectrum and how it was charged. Exhibiting did give me a little, because I meant for them to be a bit kind of floating in the middle if you're visualizing a spectrum. But I kind of interpreted that exhibiting could have been seen as a bit more educational, and so that's why people tended to prefer the statement over keeping, which may convey a sense of entrapment in association with that word. So this selection toward the nurturing language may show a societal shift toward a mutualistic typology. And what that means is where society used to be a bit more dominionistic, and that wildlife and nature and animals were seen as something to be dominated, something to be owned, or utilized for human use, which I know Dr. Stoner may have some principles on this with political theory. It's now shifting to more mutualistic typology as we advance as a society with technology and etc. And so this shift to a mutualistic typology may offer a little explanation into why there's still controversy and polarization with zoos, and that this understanding, there's a lag in the understanding of past zoos that tended to kind of convey a more dominionistic purpose in human entertainment, a lag with that and the evolving societal shift. So I think zoos are trying to cater a bit more to that evolving shift, but there's a lag in understanding that, which is where we're still seeing a bit of a controversy. So survey B, we didn't see that preference selection in the second section, and that could simply be because the language construction between the 2 items were not significantly different enough to invoke a selection. But we were seeing it in the first section, where I interpret it, I believe it might be because in section 1, our emotion item contains a lot of stronger words like freedom and enriching, and a lot of things we associate with our own lives and idea of happiness. And in logic, when we have a lot of scientific language, dimension, stimulation, accurate, and while in logic item 2 in the second section, we still have that scientific quantitative language, statistically, etc., maybe the word choice in emotion 2 in our second section isn't strong enough, or doesn't have, we kind of associate longer, healthier, could apply to anything, right? And so that's kind of my interpretation of why that we may not have seen selection there, but looking across the board at the other, the rest of the data, we are seeing selection for word choice and nurturing word choice, but in a logical tone and strewing it all together. Like I said, this raises more questions and it gets tricky, but my data definitely showed an evidence of framing effects and a preference toward framing effects, and that they're there and people are not just randomly choosing words, that they have a preference in this polarized discourse. And there's contradicting literature that says that their studies showed no preference, but most researchers and scientists would say that there is the importance of framing effects and the existence of framing effects in communication needs to be acknowledged. It needs to be addressed that they're there. And one of the things that I'll talk about at the end is that it's complex and that they could be scale-based. So some improvements I would love to make in a future study, or that I think should be made in this field, Likert style items. So to measure, of course that's strongly disagree, somewhat agree, etc. This could help us get a more detailed grasp on kind of what the exact specific feelings of our survey recipients and help us expand the data. Demographic and socioeconomic items, and so finding out who our survey recipients are, who is answering the way that they are, what could this mean, help us make a bit more correlation perhaps with the data. And of course all of these things would have been a bit more complex and a bit difficult, so at times I had to be roped in because it's a little over, my undergraduate honors thesis, but of course I acknowledge that these things would definitely advance the data. And again, further understanding the complexities of the research. So like I said, a lot of researchers and the literature is saying that framing effects in general can work on a very specific scale-based system, and that in certain places they may be stronger and more powerful, have more of an effect depending on the context of what's being discussed. And so, in conclusion, I really enjoyed this process. I'm an overthinker, but I love human psychology. I love the human mind, and in my career, I really want to get into public engagement. I love talking with people and kind of seeing what people are thinking and why they think what they do. And so, as a wildlife ecologist, I know the kinds of things I'm going to work around. But I think no matter what our field is, we're going to be dealing with people, and especially in a time where I believe our field is so important. We have to acknowledge how we're going to communicate the vast amount of scientific evidence that we have, because we're good at science now. We have current and developing methods, we have knowledge, we can back check each other, but it's all about how do we say this to people who don't quite understand or who disagree, and how do we hold dialogue on opposing sides where we can come together and discuss in a language that's appropriate for that situation. So, thank you so much. This is a picture of me and Tiva from my internship, just that you want to see. I would like to open it up now, I guess, for the general public before private screening with Kenny.